I was slated to talk about Ukraine's war crimes against civilians in the Donbass, and I will be doing that. However, as you're all aware, Israel is committing unfathomable genocide against Palestinians and warring upon Lebanon and Syrians, so I can't not make some remarks as I talk about Ukraine's war crimes and note the parallels between what Israel has systematically done against Palestinians when I make these remarks about what Ukraine has been doing in the Donbass. So I have gone to the Donbass 10 times since 2019, and the majority of those times was throughout 2022, which, as you're aware, after Russia started its special military operation, Ukraine intensified its attacks, actually before Russia started its military operation, but throughout the course of 2022, the attacks throughout the Donbass were intense. And so I'm going to be speaking about that. And I will give the caveat that I cannot address personally the accusations Ukraine has made against Russia because I can't go to those areas. As you might be aware, Ukraine has a list called Mirotvorets, which translates ironically into peacemaker, but which is really a kill list. It really is a kill list. And every time a journalist or public figure of some sort dies or is killed, they are marked liquidated on that list, as was the case with Daria Dugina 2 years ago, I believe, and numerous other public figures or journalists. So, and I don't believe I would actually be allowed into Ukraine. So that's my caveat for saying I can't address their accusations. I will address some of their claims that they've made regarding places in the Donbass that I could go to, and that's a little bit later on. But what I will say, based on what I've seen from Russia's conduct, which most analysts would say has been a restrained conduct, not a full-on onslaught like America does so well or like Israel does so well. I would say that in my opinion, a lot of Ukraine's accusations are baseless, but that's just my opinion. I did make reference to America's conduct in places like Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. But Israel, from my experience in 2009 and 2012 when I lived in Gaza, I saw firsthand the effects of Israelis' carpet bombing of Gaza. I documented it, and I saw the results of Israel's bombing with white phosphorus on civilian areas and also sniping civilians, including sniping medics, including an ambulance I was in during ceasefire hours, with at least 13 shots targeting the medics and the ambulance we were in northern Gaza. And so all this to say, when we speak of destruction, people who haven't been to the area in question, like, for example, Mariupol, if you hear in Western media, Russia destroyed Mariupol, you might have images in your mind of Raqqa in Syria or Gaza. But I was in Mariupol in April 2022, then in June, September, November, December 2022, and then on in 2023 and 2024. And I can say, yes, there was damage, there was destruction, but not the wanton destruction we're talking about when we refer to Israel's destroying of Gaza, leveling of complete apartment blocks. What I saw, and I was in the center of Mariupol where outlets like The Guardian, for example, will say, they will show satellite images and try to convince you the city was leveled. And I was there, and it was not leveled. There were areas where Ukrainian forces had embedded in, whether it was apartment buildings or other structures, and there, just like in Syria, you will see tops of the buildings blackened from the fighting that ensued between the Ukrainian forces in those buildings and the Russian forces fighting them. And then, not far away, you will see other buildings untouched. So if Russia's intent was just to destroy the city, it would then go on to rebuild, which is illogical. Why were buildings untouched? And I saw this in the center areas of Mariupol where Western media claimed it was destroyed. So I just want to make that point because for an audience that hasn't seen it in person, yeah, you might think the entire city was destroyed, and that backs the Western narrative that Russia was unprovoked and Russia just wanted to conquer Ukraine and kill all the people it could kill. And that is far from the truth. But as we see now, in its over 1 year of genocide in Gaza, Israel has not only leveled entire apartment buildings, it has ordered Palestinians to evacuate from one area to the next, and it's claimed if they go there, these are safe areas, and then it's gone and bombed these safe areas. It's bombed entire camps hosting displaced Palestinians living in tents, and it's bombed those when it's clear there's no threat whatsoever from those tents. And it continues to do this. So this is the kind of destruction that Western media is not talking about. They will say Palestinians are dying of some mysterious cause, but they won't name the actor, which is Israel. They will say Palestinians are starving, but they won't say why, because Israel's not allowing food to enter. Or for example, right now in northern Gaza, in Jabalia and Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun, the 400,000 or so residents there were ordered once again to leave, and they're not leaving because they know what happened in 1948 in the Nakba, which displaced Palestinians and killed Palestinians and created, during the creation of Israel. And they remember that, and they don't want another Nakba, although it is happening, and genocide is happening, ethnic cleansing is happening. So there are Palestinians that will have remained, and I know a young man that's living in Jabalia camp, and his house is partly destroyed, but he's not going to leave even if he dies, because it is their land and they won't be displaced again. But since October 1st, Israel has put a full siege on those northern Gaza areas, not allowing food in, have these devices called quadcopters, drones, which are firing on anyone, whether they're a journalist, whether they're a medic, or whether they're civilians trying to go to get food from somewhere. These drones are taking them out. So these are actual crimes of ethnic cleansing that are occurring right now, and if I didn't speak about it, my conscience I would not be able to sleep at night. But I will go back to the issue of the Donbass. So I've talked about what I saw in Mariupol in terms of it not being a fully destroyed city. But also, I'm sure there are many, I can't read that from this far, so my eyes are not great. There are countless testimonies from Mariupol residents saying exactly that Ukrainian forces occupied their buildings, and in many cases, Ukrainian forces fired on the buildings themselves and fired on residents trying to flee. That tactic is something that Ukrainian forces did not only in Mariupol, but in Volnovakha and throughout the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. Again and again, using the civilians as human shields, as hostages, occupying their buildings, and fighting against the Russian forces from those buildings, thereby ensuring there would be a great amount of destruction. In the city of Volnovakha, which is about halfway between Mariupol and Donetsk. Mariupol is south of Donetsk. And Volnovakha is halfway between there. And in March 2022, I went to Volnovakha with a delegation of journalists organized by Russia's Ministry of Defense. And the Ministry of Defense was trying to ensure journalists could see what was happening after that city, the fighting in that city had stopped. So the handing out of humanitarian aid, also the destruction. And we went to the main hospital, which had been pretty much destroyed. And the chief doctor there said, Ukrainian forces occupied this hospital. They had their tanks on the territory. They occupied the hospital. I told them to leave. They wouldn't leave. And when they finally fled, they mined the intensive care unit. So that's what we heard in March 2022. I actually went back to Volnovakha several times after that. In one of the times that I went back, other staff told me Ukrainian tanks were firing on the hospital before Russian forces were anywhere near it. So, and there are so many of these testimonies like that. And yet, two mainstream French media that were with that delegation, I looked up the reports afterwards. They cherry-picked the doctor's words to distort what he had said. At one point, someone asked him a specific question about which particular factions of Ukrainian soldiers were there. He said, I don't know. I don't know who they were. And that's what they put in their report. When in the 5 minutes he talked to us, which I have on video if you want to see, he clearly stated Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian military were occupying our army. So the French media whitewashed the presence of the Ukrainian forces and just made it look like this was a crazy doctor who has nothing to say, and basically focused on the destruction without giving any context as to why there was destruction there. And this is something they do all the time. This same media, we had been on a central Donetsk street, which 2 weeks prior had been bombed with a Tochka-U cluster munitions, old Soviet missile that Ukrainians have, and 21 civilians were killed and over 40 were injured. And you could see on the street the impact points of the shells that landed. And there was a memorial that locals had put up with photos of the deceased. And this media did not mention this, nor did they mention the 8 years prior to 2022 of Ukraine's bombing of the Donbass. This is the context that they deliberately omitted because they don't want to have the Western public understand there is a history and a context to prior to February 2022, because they want all of the blame to be on Russia, and then they want to create these narratives that Ukraine is defending itself and Russia is the sole actor, which they accuse of various war crimes. I did mention earlier that one of the accusations that Ukraine and Western media had made against Russia, I can actually say is definitively false, is that of mass graves. And they used this trope over and over again in 2022. They basically said, the first site they said was west of Mariupol, a place called Mangush or Manhush, depending on Ukrainian or Russian pronunciation. And they said there were mass graves there. They were citing the former mayor of Mariupol, who was nowhere near the city. He fled early on. And they were saying there were mass graves, I believe they said 30 meters wide, and they were trying to say basically Russians were killing people and throwing them into mass graves to cover up their war crimes. So I went there with a journalist and his cameraman who had a drone, and we walked around, and he got drone footage, but you didn't even need that. You could see with your eyes that it was a simple, normal cemetery that had new individual grave plots, as cemeteries do. And there were actually 2 grave diggers that worked in that cemetery there at that time, and we spoke with them, and they were indignant at the concept that they were participating in some sort of war crime and throwing tons of bodies into a mass grave, and they said, that is not the truth. We bury each person individually in each plot. And it's also worthwhile noting that during the fighting, just as we see in Gaza, people had nowhere to bury their loved ones. So they were burying them in the yards in front of their apartment buildings. And so some of these bodies, or perhaps many, I don't know, that were then transferred to Mangush would be including these people that were buried in courtyards during the fighting. We don't know the source, whether they were killed in Russian fire or Ukrainian fire. But the idea that Russia was creating a mass grave to cover up its war crimes is completely false. And they repeated this idea throughout 2022. And so I went twice more in a taxi on my own to each of the other 2 sites around Mariupol. One was a vast graveyard cemetery called Stary Krim. It's a massive and old cemetery that has a church there, and there was a funeral going on when I went there. And there was, in another part of this vast cemetery, someone was burying their elderly grandfather. I don't know the cause of death, but this, when I was there, was, I believe it was November 2022, so long after the fighting, right? And so this was another of the sites that the Western media and Ukrainian media produced satellite images, grainy satellite images of, to say, this is another mass grave, the horror, and it was a cemetery. And the third one, also in Mariupol, was a similar situation, another cemetery, much smaller, same thing, no grave, no mass pits, just a normal functioning cemetery. But with this trope, I mean, if you think of mass graves, I'm sure you can think of many examples from history, and it's a horrific thought, and therefore it's a very effective media trope, but it wasn't based in reality. Now, I do want to mention, on my first trip to the Donbass in 2019, I went completely of my own accord. I honestly, it was my first time there. I didn't speak Russian, but a press officer there was very helpful to me, and he went with me to the city of Gorlivka and then villages around Gorlivka, and these are north of Donetsk and very close to the front line. Gorlivka itself has been under Ukrainian fire since mid-2014, and so this is, again, important to note that prior to 2022, areas around the Donbass were being pummeled by Ukrainian fire. Western media was largely not reporting it, and the observers, the OSCE observers that were there to report on it, were turning blind eyes. And when I went to the village of Zaitsevo, which is in this region, the then head of that village was saying, you know, they're taking out houses, house by house, street by street. Much of the population of that community had fled, and those who remained were largely elderly who didn't want to leave or had nowhere to go. Some residents were afraid to speak to me because they were afraid of Ukrainian retribution if they were on camera, and others did speak to me. And most of them said the firing intensifies after 5 or 6 p.m. when the observers leave. then all night it's a hell of Ukrainian fire on us. So that's 2019, and I saw the remnants of houses that had been shelled days prior, one of them still smoking. So that's the context you might be aware of, but Western media was deliberately omitting. And I went back to these areas in September 2023, and the situation there is much worse. In yet another area I went to, people had fled other frontline villages to take safe haven in that city, and it was being shelled all the time. And I always ask people, who's shelling you? Because Western media says it's Russia, and they say Ukraine. I say, how do you know? And they say, because they've been doing it since 2014. And I say, why are they shelling you? And they say, because they don't consider us human. And to the contrary, when I would talk with Donbass civilians and Donbass soldiers, I would ask them, do you hate Ukrainians? And they say, no, they're our brothers and sisters. We went to school with them. We traveled, we studied in Ukraine. We hate the Kiev regime. We hate the Nazis embedded with the Ukrainian army, but we don't hate the Ukrainian people. And I've heard this over the years. I've heard this, and I make a point of asking people this. One of the most insidious I've seen is Ukraine's use of mine lepestok, or what's colloquially known as petal or butterfly mines. These are tiny mines the size of a lighter. They're very lightweight, very hard to see. They can be a green or brown earthy color, and they're fired in rockets containing over 300 of these. And they don't always, in fact, most of the time they don't detonate when they land. Their design is to float down and land until something steps on them, animal or human. And so in late July, Ukraine fired rockets with these mines on Donetsk and other areas. And the next morning, I went to see areas where there was an amassment of the mines, and it was terrifying because there were arrows saying, mine, danger, mine. And I looked, and I was very close, and I could not see them. They blend in that well. Since then, 167 civilians have lost their foot or their hands to these mines, including 10 children, and 3 civilians have died of their injuries. And so the other insidious aspect about these mines is if they land on a rooftop or in a tree, once an area has been cleared, they can float down to an area that is deemed safe. And then someone thinks it's safe and doesn't walk so carefully looking at their feet, and they lose a foot. So that is a war crime. Ukraine signed the convention and ratified it again later to not use those mines and destroy its 6 million stock of the mines, and it hasn't done so, and it is using the mines against all international law. In other war crimes, well, it's just the basic shelling. Throughout 2022, particularly June, August, and September, the Ukrainian shelling of central areas, completely, utterly civilian areas, no military infrastructure whatsoever of Donetsk, was intense. In September, in the space of 5 days alone, in 3 different days of shelling attacks, 26 civilians were killed. And I went to each of the sites and saw the remains, or the parts of the remains of the bodies of the civilians that were killed. It was a gruesome sight, and it was a completely civilian area, a marketplace, just a normal street. And these kind of acts of terrorism often are being conducted with Western weapons. So this whole talk of whether the West will okay Ukraine to fire shells into Russia, Ukraine's already been shelling Russian civilians with Western weapons for a very long time. In fact, in August, Ukrainian shelling in the center of Donetsk started about 200 meters from the hotel I was then staying at, and the 4th and 5th shell landed 10 meters and directly next to the hotel. Now, the hotel is known to house journalists, particularly Russian journalists, so I can't say definitively they were being targeted, but it's quite possible because the shells got incrementally closer, the last one blowing the windows in, and I had just been standing in the lobby but stepped out of the lobby, and thank goodness I did, or otherwise I would have been lacerated with glass. Not long ago, a Ukrainian drone strike killed the 30th Russian journalist. So Ukraine has been targeting Russian journalists, much like Israel is targeting Palestinian journalists. This particular journalist was a young man, a very courageous man of integrity, and he was reporting at an area that, a monastery that Ukraine has been targeting over the years. And he had gone back there to do another report when a drone spotted him and dropped its munition on him and killed him. Some days prior to that, other Russian journalists were targeted in a similar drone strike in a different area. So this is a point, we hear often in Syria, for example, the Syrian government is targeting journalists, they would say. Or they'll say the Russian government is targeting journalists. The Ukrainian government is targeting journalists, but none of the journalists' lobby support groups will speak about it, much less Western media, just like they minimalize Israel's killing of well over 100 Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Two other important points I want to make, and then I'll wrap it up. Ukraine accuses Russia of kidnapping children. Now, children have been evacuated from areas under Ukrainian shelling or frontline conflict areas, and actually went to a southern Russian city called Anapa in late 2022 to speak with people there. And first thing I'll say is they're being held in very good conditions. They're not like being held in a school like civilians in Gaza are forced to live on the floors. They had nice seaside apartments that I would have been happy to live in. But aside from that, I asked them, have you been forced to come here? They said, by the shelling, we've been forced to come here, but we're grateful that we've been brought here. And I met a woman that had 3 kids, and they were there, I saw them. So it wasn't just her lying to me about having 3 kids. And she said her in-laws kept calling her to say, where are the kids, where are the kids? And she'd say, well, they're swimming, they're at the movies, they're playing. And the in-laws believed the Ukrainian media that Russia had kidnapped their children. And she had to put them on the phone so that the in-laws would understand they'd been lied to. So this notion about Russia kidnapping children is another media trope. But in April 2023, I went back to Donbass, and with a French journalist, Christelle Niant, who's been reporting courageously from there since 2016, we met people who had fled from Artyomovsk, or otherwise known as Bakhmut. And these people spoke of the horrors of the Ukrainian shelling, again, of their buildings as they were in the basement taking cover, but they also spoke of Ukrainian police, I believe it was, coming under the name of White Angels, which is reminiscent of white helmets in Syria in any case. But these White Angels were looking for children, and they were saying they were going to take them to safety. The parents didn't want their children taken, so they were hiding them in basements. And so we took these testimonies, and some of the people were saying, these people that came looking for the kids, they had the names and the ages of the children. They were looking for specific children. In any case, these types of reports emanated from other areas after that, liberated from Ukrainian forces. So it wasn't a one-off of these people from Artyomovsk. It's a scenario that is being repeated throughout areas that Ukraine was controlling. So the question of who is kidnapping children becomes clearer here. What they're doing with them, I can't definitively say. There's talk of organ trade and other atrocities, but I can't speak to that. But I can say that people that I spoke to didn't want these forces to take their kids. So, and that's something that you will most likely not hear about in Western media. I really strongly believe we have to do everything in our power to keep getting the truth out about what Israel is doing. It's committing genocide and ethnic cleansing in Palestine, not only in Gaza, also in the West Bank, and now against Lebanon. And it's just mind-boggling to me that all of the things over the years Western media has accused Russia of doing in Syria, or the Syrian government of doing in Syria, Russia of doing in Ukraine, is literally being done by Israel, live-streamed 24/7 from Palestinian journalists and civilian journalists in Gaza. And yet, even when the United Nations representatives speak out, nothing is being done. So I don't have an answer of what we can do to end this, but I do say we have to speak out about it. And also, the Palestinian people have a right to resist this brutal occupation and genocide. Thank you.